In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
When I was an irritating, impish schoolboy, I used to do impressions of my teachers to entertain my fellow students. I would pick on their mannerisms, affectations, attempts to be funny, scary, or authoritative, and I'll do my best to undermine them in every way I could. Well, I did tell you I was an irritating schoolboy. Political satire is not really that different. It takes the reality claims made by politicians, whether it's Trump saying that immigrants are eating American dogs.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
Or Keir Starmer insisting upon his working class roots.
I accept I earn a lot of money in the job I am now in, but when I grew up, my dad was a tool maker. He worked in a factory. It's true.
And exposes them to a ridiculing form of interrogation. Unlike rational, deliberative contestation, where A disputes the claims of B on the basis of cognitive appeals to evidence and logical sense-making, satire is more playful. Satirists assault the claims of truth and reality made by their victims. It turns claims made by politicians in all seriousness into a basis for ridicule. In this sense, it's a very important means of political critique, for it allows us to express in the most visceral fashion, through the sound of our laughter, our sense of disbelief in claims that defy the evidence of our lived experience. If to be applauded, cheered, and patted on the back is the ultimate ambition of a political speaker, to be laughed at is the ultimate nightmare, for it breaks the magical force of authority that their speech relies upon. In puncturing power, satire, ridicule, and comedy reduce the mesmerizing force of oratory, often exposing it as manifest waffle. In a bid to seem relatable, politicians will sometimes try to be funny at their own expense. These are often rather awkward moments, tending to comprise limp attempts at faux self-disparagement.
You also mentioned, Madam Secretary, the exchange of gifts between President Obama and I. I think we've got it slightly wrong, because I've given him a table tennis table and he's given me a barbecue. But when you see us standing next to each other, it is quite clear that the person who needs the exercise is the British Prime Minister, and the person who needs the barbecue is the President of the United States.
Most political satire doesn't involve politicians poking gentle fun at themselves, but critics pointing to vices, foibles, and inconsistencies that politicians would prefer that nobody ever noticed. There was a time when the most celebrated political satire involved the public simply looking on as a giggling spectators, from the court jesters of ancient China and medieval Europe to TV productions like That Was a Week That Was or Spitting Image. The role of citizens was to snigger from the back row of the stalls as the important people were knocked down a peg or two. But as with so much more in the practice of political democracy, the internet changed all that. In the past few decades, puncturing the images of the powerful and laughing at their false claims has been open up for millions of people. We can all do it. We might say that satire has been democratised. No longer can politics be about one-way messaging from the top to the bottom. We're now in an era of circulatory memes that both invigorate politics by injecting an aesthetic dimension that many find more democratic and relatable in the old language of high political polemic, while at the same time the online meme culture engenders a permanently ironic and often negative tone, which makes it much easier to knock down than to connect with others or to develop thoughts. When everyone and everything can be turned into a joke, how do we engage in serious talk about the political challenges that really matter to us? The wars, the invasions, the pandemics, the crises. But now that everyone can be that irritating kid disrupting the authority of the teacher, what does that do to our capacity for democratic self-determination? In what ways might popular laughter trump paternalistic bombast? Can we speak of satire as meaningful political opposition? Well, to answer those big questions, I'm talking today to Dr Ros Southern from the University of Liverpool, who has a new book called Memes and Politics in the UK. Well, Ros, you've written a really interesting book called Memes and Politics in the UK. What I want to ask you, first of all, is, are there any aspects of what politicians say or do that we shouldn't make jokes about?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I suppose I've got my own views on that kind of personally. But while I was researching the book, I was really quite surprised about there really did seem to be no limits on what people did make memes about and what people did joke about. There's memes and kind of meme groups about the Ukraine war, even the war in Gaza, kind of making jokes and memes about people actually who were involved in the war themselves and are kind of being attacked. And I think part of that is, a coping mechanism a little bit. And
Yeah.
so I suppose I wouldn't want to say to people who are in those situations that they're not allowed to joke about it, because that's something that is for them, really. But I think maybe the other side of that is that perhaps it does blunt kind of some of the critique of politicians in some ways. If we're just joking about them rather than making a kind of substantive critique, it perhaps does let them off the hook a little bit more than it should.
This is interesting. So my next question is, what's the value of making jokes about politics and politicians? And in a way, you've given two possible answers, not incompatible answers. One, that this is some sort of coping mechanism. It offers a relief. It's a way of talking about something that is in some respects perhaps unbearable in certain situations. But at the same time, you're saying perhaps the very tone of humour is a way of evading and distracting from the seriousness, the core moral issues at the heart of politics. So for you, you clearly think that there is a value in political humour because you've chosen to study it. Is that value something that you think is more positive than negative in terms of how we incorporate politics into our culture?
Yeah, so I mean, the question that you've just asked there is essentially the central tension that I try to pick apart in the book. So this idea that I did find, in one sense, that it was bringing people who otherwise would not be very interested in politics into at least a space where they feel they can engage with politics and where they talk about politics. But at the same time, perhaps it does trivialize politics. Again, perhaps it sort of blunts the critique. So this was something that I really tried to pick apart. what you were saying about whether there's value in it.
Mm.
I mean, some of the critiques that I found and some of the memes that I include in the book, they were at least, as I'd say, kind of devastating as a very incisive kind of critique from a really serious journalist in some ways, even
Right.
though
Mm.
they were potentially pretty unserious in some ways. A lot of them did really get to the heart of the political questions as well. In some ways, I don't think we can say it's one or the other, really.
I mean, that's fascinating. So you're saying that, I mean, clearly like most of us, I imagine you're a political pluralist, but you're actually also a kind of an epistemic pluralist in the sense that you're saying you can get there through deep, rational analysis, but perhaps there's an element of ridicule and artistic expression, which is not easily comprehensible at the cognitive level, that you think is just as penetrating.
Well, I mean, one of the chapters that I included in the book was on a very specific kind of digital satirist called Cold War Steve. I don't know if any of you guys have ever kind of seen his work, but he originated on social media, uses a lot of kind of social media and mimetic devices in his work, but it's also got this kind of really more classical satire, kind of a lot of classical satire elements in it as well. And I think work like that does get at that, like you were saying, it's something that is perhaps easier to understand almost on a sort of visceral level. And the critique cuts through really harshly. So, like he doesn't hold back on some of the politicians he doesn't like sometimes. So I think in terms of, trivializing politics, blunting the critique, yes, maybe because we're all a bit distracted, we're all laughing. But I think if you look at it, someone looking at some of these memes that someone like Cold War Steve puts out, or some of the other meme makers that I look at, you couldn't be under any illusions that they take politics seriously. They think politicians should take politics more seriously. So it is quite interesting to study kind of those texts.
Yeah. What is it about politicians as a group that makes it so easy for them to become the butt of popular humour? You can make fun of all kinds of people, but it seems that politicians have almost get up in the morning and put a target on their back. What do you think is it that makes that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that when I was writing the kind of background section of the book, it's kind of in some ways always happened, although not to the extent that we've seen recently with kind of the rise of social media and things. I think it's probably, maybe some of them are a little bit pompous, which is the kind of classic, butt of satire, kind of skewering the pomposity. And I think in some ways we did enter a little bit of an era of just fundamentally unserious politicians in a lot of ways, which happened at a time when suddenly we had a lot more access to, anyone can have a voice on social media. We've got kind of Photoshop apps. We've got even AI nowadays where anyone can make a meme. And I think that just lends itself to a kind of acceleration of this kind of communication in terms of this sort of digital political humour. And yeah, we've kind of had some fairly unserious politicians recently. So, I've seen that Liz Truss is back in the headlines just this afternoon. Her whole premiership was pretty much defined by a meme. If you think about the lettuce that the Star had on their live feed, it's just kind of something that sort of defines this era a little bit.
Now, I'm going to ask you a very obvious question, because there are some people listening who are not nearly as hip and cool and in touch with things as I am, who are going to ask, what is she talking about when she talks about memes? Could you explain to us what they are and how they work and why we're talking about them?
This is actually probably, there's a less straightforward answer to this than I think most people might imagine. But the kind of classic meme, as I kind of grew up with in some ways, would be like a kind of template image, usually of some maybe random person or animal, and it has like a bright white kind of impact font caption on it, usually top and bottom. This has kind of evolved in recent years. So now it's kind of, I talk about kind of mimetic communication. So even the sort of repetition of a phrase now has become a little bit of a meme. So this is kind of people calling Keir Starmer Keith Starmer because they don't think he should be named after Keir Hardie, one of their heroes, and things like this. And it can even be kind of punctuation. So there was a far-right meme that was then co-opted by kind of anti-fascists and other kind of progressive people, which is kind of putting triple parentheses around words to signify that people were, they were othering people for being Jewish. And then other people kind of co-opted that to kind of, make that less obvious. So it's become a lot wider, and it's kind of anything, any form of communication that's kind of repeated, that kind of references the prior iteration of it, and kind of, sort of is repeated and I guess remixed throughout time.
That's a great explanation. Could you sit down and sort of invent a meme? I mean, I remember years ago, and I can't remember who it was, but she was an American celebrity, and she said, I'm going to come over to Britain and I'm going to invent a word, and I'm going to make that word popular because I'm going to keep using it. And actually it didn't. I can't remember what the word was. I can't remember what she was, but it didn't work. It's harder than she thought. But with a meme, I mean, could you, if I set you the challenge this evening and gave you, all your social media platforms to do this with, do you think you could have a fair shot at creating a meme and saying, yeah, in a week's time, a month's time, whenever it's going to be, everyone's going to be talking about that?
That's such an interesting question, but I do feel like there's no better way to kill a meme than kind of being like self-aware and sort of serious about it.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't know whether either of you saw the JD Vance memes recently where they were basically just, well, firstly, they started off as babyfying him, and then it just became a little bit more like, they were doing lots of different kind of iterations of the JD Vance face, making him like bright red and turning him into like a minion and things like that. And he responded to it. So he actually replied to someone or something with one of the JD Vance memes, and everyone was like, okay, joke over, that's it, pack it up. And I think if you try to make something happen, it's just not going to happen. It has to be this kind of organic, almost spontaneous. It has to really sort of tap into a moment. And I don't think you can do it top down like that.
I suspect you're right. Well, look, while we're defining things, and I invite our listeners who are of a sensitive and delicate persuasion to put their hands over their ears right now. But Ros, what's a shit post?
Okay, yeah. I kind of wanted this in the title and was strongly advised to remove it. Yeah, a shit post is essentially a kind of low effort post, usually fairly nonsensical or just kind of borderline trolling. It can have a large degree of irony. It's something like, instead of actually arguing back with someone, you just kind of do a spoonerism of their name. So I'd just say like Kevin Stolman to respond to you, if instead of like if you make a really kind of big political point and I can't be bothered, I just sort of put that. Or I don't know, I'd Photoshop you to look like JD Vance, babyfy you or something like that. So it's essentially a little bit like trolling, low effort kind of posting, winding people up a bit, and it's become quite popular in political discourse online.
Listen, when I've made it as a podcaster, I'm going to try and become a shit poster. That's my next ambition in life. Ros, how do you think politicians should respond to memes? I mean, you've told us how they shouldn't, which is JD Vance trying to appropriate it. I mean, what do you do? Should they just pretend to laugh, or should they pretend not to hear it? What's the advice?
I mean, I think politicians responding to memes about themselves should completely ignore it. So one of the kind of good examples of this, I think, would be Bernie Sanders. So there was a huge online group around Bernie Sanders called the Bernie Sanders Dank Meme Shitposting Club or something. And he was aware of this, completely aware of it, but he never mentioned it in any of his posts at all. Probably another fairly good example would be Kamala Harris and the coconut tree memes. Again, I don't know if people saw those during the US election. She kind of tiptoed around it, gave a few kind of, I'd say, like kind of shady mentions towards it where she was clearly aware of it, but she didn't particularly co-opt it and actually use it, because as they probably know, that kind of kills that momentum behind all that kind of free chat that they're getting. Another really interesting example was how Labour used memes on TikTok during the last election, in that they did seem to basically be shitposting on TikTok. So they were throwing out lots of classic memes. They were kind of trolling Rishi Sunak a little bit. They were getting a huge amount of engagement on these memes on TikTok. But then they were kind of peppering in the kind of policy heavy TikToks, the kind of more mobilizing TikTok. And it was like they were kind of trusting the TikTok algorithm to serve these more kind of persuasive and mobilizing videos in to people's feeds after they'd had a laugh at the kind of silly output as well. So there are some interesting examples. And it seems like politicians are starting to get it a little bit more, maybe.
They clearly need to bring you in to advise them how to deal with it. So, what is the funniest political meme you've ever seen? What was the one that you still keep going back to and looking at and thinking, that is funny?
I mean, I really did find some of the JD Vance stuff very funny, mainly because it was just such a random, weird outpouring. And it was in kind of the context of something I felt that was really, I really disagreed with the work, because it kind of came after the press conference where Trump and Vance were being really rude to Zelensky, and I kind of felt like, what are you even doing? So I kind of found that funny.
It was payback in a way.
Yeah, and it kind of felt like it sort of just worked, and it was so spontaneous that it was almost like a perfect example of this, kind of exemplifies it.
You said something really interesting, which is, you had already decided that you didn't like JD Vance, maybe in general, but particularly because of what he did in this horrible meeting. So I suppose that raises the other political question, which is, what about the people who looked at that meeting and said, yeah, USA, go for it, Trump, put Zelensky in his place? They presumably would not be looking at that meme and saying, that's the funniest meme they've ever seen.
I mean, the JD Vance one was a very interesting example because quite a lot of his supporters seemed to find it really funny for some reason. I was also a bit confused about that. But I suppose, a lot of them were also saying, this is pathetic. Is this all the left has got? So I suppose, humour is always in the eye of the beholder. And maybe if it was about someone that I supported a little bit more, I might not have found it that funny. Having said that, some of the, the coconut tree memes about Kamala, little bit more, progressive politician, were also kind of laughing at her personality a little bit, it has to be said, even though it was quite good-natured, I think. I still thought that kind of, again, this kind of carnival atmosphere was sort of, again, it exemplifies this kind of thing, and some of them were very funny.
Yeah. So to the final question, and a weighty question, I guess, because clearly we're in the midst of a crisis of democracy. I know there have been lots of crises of democracy, but boy, if this isn't a crisis of democracy, I don't know what is. Here we have satire, we have online humour, we have memes. Is there any kind of specific hope that you can see? Or is there a relationship that you can identify between the presence of these phenomena and a way out of this terrible mess that politics has got itself into?
That's a very weighty question. I mean, I think I do kind of argue in the book a little bit, although I think you can't obviously make those kind of direct links, that things getting worse are fertile ground for satire and kind of always have been. Kind of desperate political situations do tend to make people want a little bit of levity, a little bit of solace, can be a sort of perfect context for a rise of kind of humour, and particularly aimed at the people they feel might be not doing enough to kind of solve the situations. Whether I think memes are a way out of it, it's kind of like we've been having these questions for 20 years about whether social media organising and things like this will lead to the revolution and things like that. For younger people, I just think it now is just part of how they talk about politics. So it maybe doesn't even feel that new or that different to them. And I think when I see memes going viral that are very political and actually have quite complex political points within them, I think sometimes that can be a point of entry for young people into at least this kind of political space, thinking about politics in a way that's accessible to them. And, that's obviously can be used by good actors and bad actors, however you want to define that as well. But it does seem that is something that's definitely happening. Young people do talk about politics in this way now. They organise through memes. If you ever look on the activist pages of kind of the student activists, they'll always be using memes. So I think it's just something that now is a way that people talk about politics. And I suppose the jury's still out on the actual impact and effects that's going to have, long term.
Ros, I've really enjoyed listening to you, and I've actually learned a lot from what you've had to say. I thought I had one of the best jobs in the world, but now I have discovered that the job of studying shitposts has got to be the perfect arrangement for getting up in the morning.
It is the dream.
The dream job. Study them, but don't produce them. So thank you very, very much indeed for your time.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.